All right, we're up to chapter 6 on my autobiography, Meeting My Wife, and this is a picture of us here on the left that was done by a friend of ours who was a professional photographer. And okay, I think I was about 25 there, maybe 26, and she was 22, I think. Okay, about a year went by, and I had returned to my social circle at Coffee Plantation near Mill Avenue. This was now September of 1994. My friend Vinny knew this woman who he claimed wanted to meet me. She was looking for an intellectual man, and word had gotten round to her about me, and she kept telling him that she wanted to talk with me. I had run into her once when she was working at Substop across the street from the campus, and I had gone in there and she'd made a sub for me. But at that time she didn't know who I was, and I didn't notice any particular interest in me on her part. In fact, it seemed like she was flirting with everyone else but me. But now every time she and Vinny went out, as friends only, he would tell me that she was being very persistent about meeting me. However, I think Vinny really wanted to sleep with her and was jealous of any possibility of the two of us hooking up, so he was more of an obstacle, really, than anything else. One night we happened to be sitting outside in front of a small coffee shop called Higher Ground, located right across the street from my apartment. And then there it is. We were the only two people there, and I had a copy of Heidegger's Being in Time with me that we were discussing as I was enthused about reading it, but wasn't yet able to make much progress with it. Then all of a sudden this blue pickup truck stops in front of us with screeching tires and slams into the curb. The driver's side door flies open and out she comes, the woman who had become my wife, Melinda Kristoff. She ran over to us and breathlessly introduced herself, told me she was glad to finally be able to meet me, but said she was on her way somewhere and got back into the truck and left. That was the first time anybody ever stopped with screeching tires at the sight of me. That was a first. And then a few nights later, Vinny and I were sitting outside at a table on the porch of Coffee Plantation, and here she comes, casually strolling by, walking her bicycle, and then stops to say hello. I immediately pulled out a chair for her and insisted that she sit down and join us for some coffee, and so she did. She was very pretty, 22 years old, a little on the plump side, not obese though, or even really fat. Everything was all in proportion, and she still had the classic hourglass shape. She wasn't skinny, but that never bothered me, although it bothered her a lot. As we were talking, she got out her sketchbook and started drawing various things in our surroundings, and as the evening wore on, it was eventually whittled down to just the two of us, and it was getting late, and I knew for certain that she liked me, so I invited her to come back to my studio apartment with me and watch some movies. I had rented a French adaptation of Madame Bovary, but hadn't watched it yet, and I knew she was a literate individual and that she would probably like the film. I was right. We packed her bicycle into the trunk of my car and drove back to my place, where we sat watching a couple of movies, and then after they were over, it was probably nearing 2 or 3 a.m., we started making out. We did a lot of kissing, but she was reluctant to go any further since she didn't want me to just dump her after having sex with her, as she later explained. We just kept talking all through the night until dawn came, and we went back to her place, a house she was living in with her sister, and slept in her bed. In the morning, I woke up to her giving me a blowjob, and so it went on from there. We were back and forth over the next couple of months between her place and my place, having amazing sex constantly. Our sexual chemistry was incredible, as we both liked exactly the same things, and it remained that way for the entire 15 years that we were together. Never one problem in the bedroom, ever. In fact, it was so explosive that we were experiencing poltergeist phenomena whenever we had sex. I remember us sitting on the couch at her house, and she had just gotten on top of me, facing me, and impaled herself, when I noticed something strange across the room behind her. There was a little candle burning in a small cube-shaped crystal glass, and all of a sudden the tiny candle flame shot up into the air about 3 feet, I kid you not, and there was a loud pop sound. When I got up to examine it, the glass cube had split neatly in half for no apparent reason. There was nothing potentially explosive anywhere near it. Sometimes we would be making love and the stereo would suddenly turn itself up to maximum volume, and one time I remember a standing mirror at the foot of her bed that cracked in half while we were having sex. So we were definitely generating some heat. Now, we'd been together for about 4 months when the following event transpired. I got her pregnant by accident. We had sex in a movie theater in the back row while Woody Allen's Bullets Over Broadway was playing on the screen to a mostly empty auditorium. I accidentally came inside of her because there was no room to pull out in time. She was sitting on me facing the screen. We never used condoms, not once in the entire relationship, and she wasn't on birth control. We just always used the pull-out method, which worked just fine. Except for this one little time, and bam, we conceived. I only ever came in my ex's vagina twice in the entire relationship, and we conceived both times. Now that's some chemistry. But we were young, I was 25 and she was 22. We had no money. We were living together now full-time in my small studio apartment, and we were fighting quite a lot. Those first 6 months or so of our relationship were stormy, and I wasn't at all convinced that it was going to be a stable, long-term relationship. So, with great reluctance, we had the fetus aborted. We were both sad about it and cried over it afterwards. I was terrified of having a child, as I was afraid I would just perpetuate the cycle of abuse that I had been put through. Although, as it turns out, that wasn't the case. When we finally did get around to having a child, I was a great father, not abusive at all, and I got punished for it later on, as we'll see. Years later, when I was interviewing a medium, I asked her about the fate of that aborted child. She said that it would have been a girl and that she will eventually return into my life, most likely as a grandchild. We decided then to move to another apartment in the same complex, a one-bedroom that was slightly larger and that was located in the front of the complex just overlooking the street. You can see the window of it between the two pillars on the right in the photo that is the frontispiece of Chapter 5. The apartment seemed somehow smaller than the other one. I never liked it, but we weren't there long. The neighborhood that we lived in on Lemon Street was slowly going downhill. It has since been gentrified. Gang kids and drug dealers were moving in because the rents were so cheap and the landlords greedy and stupid. And one day as I was walking home from the campus library with a stack of books in my arm, which included Gene Gebser's Ever-Present Origin, another big Spengler Campbell level event in my intellectual evolution, I saw this Hispanic kid trying to peer through the curtains of a window that was about 2 doors down from us. I minded my own business, however, and went inside to the bedroom to put my books away, and no sooner had I started doing that than the sound of shattering glass suddenly exploded, and my ex yelled, "John, you better get out here." I opened the front door just in time to see the kid helping himself to a VCR from the top of a television that was situated just in front of the window. We called the cops, and I reported the whole thing, but they basically just shrugged their shoulders and went away. For a couple of days, we forgot about it. But then the gang kids started harassing my ex. She would pull into the parking lot, and they would say aggressive, confrontational things to her. Again, I shrugged it off. That's life in cheap college neighborhoods. But then a couple of days later, as we were sitting down to dinner and the X-Files on a Friday night, a knock came at the door. When I went over to the door and peered through the peephole, I saw 2 gang kids standing there, looking around suspiciously. They knocked again and then disappeared, saying, "We'll be waiting for you." Uh-oh. This was suddenly a very bad situation. What do we do? We called the cops again, and when the cop came to the door, he listened with skeptical bemusement to our tale of being harassed by gang kids. He was a complete idiot, totally clueless. I watched a Camaro drive by on the street just behind him. It was still daylight, going very, very slowly, with 2 gang kids giving us dirty looks. Then we called her sister's friend, who showed up in his gleaming hot rod in a matter of minutes and escorted us out of there. So that ended 7 years of my life at that apartment complex. Later, we called relatives to go in and get our furniture out of there for us. So now we wound up in my mother's basement for about 2 weeks, but the situation there was uncomfortable for the following reason. A new family drama had played itself out recently between my mother and her mother. My mother had stored up quite a bit of anger over the years as the result of being an abused child, and I think that anger played a causal role in what now transpired. My maternal grandmother, after divorcing the rocket scientist, then hooked up with a man who was the exact opposite. This is one of the dumbest and most mentally incompetent individuals I have ever encountered in my life. His name was Bob, and he was a mailman. But he was a total dud, a complete schlemiel. He let life just walk all over him. He was always moody and irritable as a consequence, just like my paternal grandfather, and he didn't like children, so as a child I had never liked him one bit. But they were together for many years. In 1975, he was riding his motorcycle down Indian School Road, and a truck that didn't see him slammed right into him, nearly killing him. He was injured so badly that he was in the hospital for months. But he and Dorothy got a big settlement out of it, something like $300,000, which back then was close to $1 million. And with that money, they bought a 3-story house in Scottsdale with a large pool that I loved swimming in as a child, as the following Polaroid, taken in 1979, illustrates. With some of that money, they also invested in an apartment complex. By the time of the mid-90s, however, they had run out of money and moved into a small box-like house in Mesa. Bob worked as a security guard, and as usual, Dorothy didn't work at all. But about the year 1994 or so, they got a return on the investment from the apartment complex. It wasn't a huge amount of money, maybe 20 grand, but it became the cause of the end of their marriage. My grandmother had always had an enabling relationship with her son, my mother's brother, David. He was always drunk and on one hard drug or another. He did not adapt well to his father's suicide, which basically ruined his life. He was addicted to heroin for many years and then later to opioid pills, and my grandmother was always giving him money, and I'm sure she knew very well what he was using it for. My step-grandfather, to his credit, absolutely refused to allow her to use any of the money to give it to her son to piss it away on drugs. They got into a huge fight over it, and she kicked him out. He had no place to go, so he went to my mother's, and soon they hooked up and got married. Later, my mother told me that back in the 70s, after she divorced my father, she had had a brief fling with Bob, who then cheated on my grandmother with her own daughter. I remember us staying in his trailer in Scottsdale for a few months. He was never there, as he had already moved in with my grandmother in the tiny green cube house in front of Camelback Mountain. But this decision of my mother's, which everyone else in the family thought was stupid, created a huge rift in the family. You were either on one side or the other, my mother's or her mother's. I had always loved my maternal grandmother. She loved me just as unconditionally as my Aunt Lil had done. Never once raised her voice at me. Always tried to get from me whatever I wanted, and absolutely adored me. She was the one who told me my authorial name should be John David Ebert, as it is mellifluous, whereas John Ebert is forgettable. She was my favorite relative, and now I could no longer speak to her as I had naturally decided with my mother in this family feud. I had always liked my dysfunctional uncle as well. My brother and I seemed to be the only two family members other than Dorothy who really enjoyed his wit and rebelliousness. But Dorothy and David sided against the entire rest of the family, and so neither side spoke to one another for the next 15 years. It wasn't until Bob had died and was out of the way that my mother resumed speaking to her mother, and the family rift was healed, sort of. Anyway, so Bob was now living with my mother, and both my mother and my ex knew that he found my ex attractive and was flirting with her. One time my ex told me that he accidentally let his bathrobe fall open to expose himself to her, so we had to get out of there quickly. But fortunately, we found a cute little red brick house to rent a few streets away in the same neighborhood in Central Mesa. The landlord was thrilled to have us, as she was tired of renting the place to drug dealers. It was a small box-shaped two-bedroom house that I liked very much. Green grass in the front yard with a row of orange trees and only one neighbor to the right of us. Everything else around us was mostly deserted office space. We loved it and spent the next 5 years there until April of 2000. Here it is, although it's a 2017 Google Street View photo where the orange trees have been sheared away for some reason. I was employed by the Joseph Campbell Foundation, so I did all my work for them remotely, which enabled me to stay at home, where I would spend the days sitting out on the front porch, smoking cigars and reading book after book after book, and read, write, and edit all day. My ex, on the other hand, was hired by her father, who owned a ramshackle construction company, to be a site supervisor. But the problem there was that construction work is a male-dominant field, and those kinds of men aren't exactly comfortable with female supervisors. They were very condescending toward her and did not take her the least bit seriously. She was constantly on the phone with them, screaming at the top of her voice, louder, I think, than she ever even yelled at me. And I told her, "You're not going to get anywhere with these guys yelling at them like that." But she was stubborn and willful and persisted with it for about a year. Now, the Joseph Campbell Foundation had made some bad editing decisions with his posthumous books. HarperCollins, who had taken them on, wanted another bestseller, another Power of Myth or Hero with 1,000 Faces, and the editor in charge had made the dumb decision to put out a collection of all of Campbell's various scattered essays and talks on James Joyce, Mythic World's Modern Words. There's a big bestseller there, all right. Then he followed that with the travel diaries that Campbell composed on his journeys to India and Japan, and that's the project they hired me to work on when they brought me on board. Not exactly a New York Times bestseller either. And then we put out a collection of selected essays, The Mythic Dimension, another dud. And so HarperCollins terminated the contract and I was out of a job. I realized then that I had better get busy and start writing my own books. I had already started a couple of years earlier, interviewing some contemporary thinkers, most of them scientists, about the impact of mythology on their work. I started with the chaos mathematician Ralph Abraham, the author of Chaos Gaia Eros, and he agreed to allow me to interview him over the telephone. And Ralph Abraham happened to be a close personal friend of somebody named William Irwin Thompson. And now comes the Thompson event in my life, another atom bomb. A friend of mine at the Campbell Foundation, John LaBelle, a professor of architecture who taught at Pratt in New York and had been a close friend of Campbell's, asked me if I had ever heard of William Irwin Thompson. I had not. He strongly recommended that I read Thompson, who did something with myth that Campbell had not, namely cross-fertilizing it with science. So I went to the ASU library and found 2 of his books, The Time-Falling Bodies Take Delight and Pacific Shift, and took them home and gobbled them down like candy. I had found yet another great mind. Soon I read through all of Thompson's books in rapid succession. Here was yet another well-rounded, erudite intellect who had synthesized myth studies with popular culture and the sciences. And this guy was still alive. I decided I absolutely had to interview him. So I called up John LaBelle, who gave me his phone number, and when I got Thompson on the phone, I told him, to at least give me some kind of credibility, that I worked for the Joseph Campbell Foundation and that I wanted to interview him and then publish the interview somewhere. But then he began a tirade of invective against Campbell, whom he said had stopped reading anything published after 1945, mostly true, and that he'd never read Gene Gebser or Marshall McLuhan or Rudolf Steiner. And then he hung up on me. Wow, who were these new people I had never heard of? I went to the library to investigate. I brought all their books home with me and began to read through them. Whole new intellectual horizons began to open up for me. Thompson was helping me to exit from the mind and world of Joseph Campbell, whose brain I had been stuck inside of for years. Eventually, after John LaBelle interceded on my behalf, Thompson abruptly called me back and we did the interview, which thrilled me. I later published it in David Feidler's anthology, Alexandria. This was one of the first pieces of nonfiction that I ever wrote. The first nonfiction piece I ever wrote had been an essay requested by John LaBelle for his Joseph Campbell Foundation newsletter. He wanted me to write something about the poetry of Robinson Jeffers, Campbell's favorite poet. Up to that point, the fall of 1994, I had never written any nonfiction except for college papers. But I had grown tired of struggling with fiction and failing to find a proper voice or identity as a fiction writer. The same dilemma still plagued me as it did in college. Did I want to write science fiction or highbrow literature? I still didn't know and couldn't figure out how to decide. I did have the idea for a novel percolating in my mind about a genetic engineer looking for a way to harness and enslave the protogenetic life force in his laboratory, but at that point it was still embryonic. It is often the case that the more creatively inclined thinkers begin as frustrated fiction writers. Plato began wanting to be the next Euripides, but he couldn't do it, so he invented the genre of the Platonic dialogue instead. Oswald Spengler also began as a playwright. His early play entitled Montezuma is still in existence, though it hasn't been translated yet from the German into English, though I hope to do so in the future for my Iconic Books Press. And indeed, I've already started on it. I translated the first page yesterday. It's not as hard as I thought it would be. It should be out through my press with high-res AI illustrations in a few months. And Campbell himself also started as a fiction writer. He wrote short stories for many years, all the way up until the age of 40, when he finally let it go and shifted to nonfiction. And likewise with myself, the moment I sat down to write that essay on Robinson Jeffers, I knew I was done with fiction, temporarily. It came easily and effortlessly. I already had a clear voice and command over the English language, and suddenly it just clicked. And at that point I knew I was going to be some sort of literary intellectual. Here's the first page of the piece from the Joseph Campbell newsletter, fall 1994. And here it is. It's something like 6 or 7 pages. And it's very difficult to read, to get a screenshot of it that is large enough for it to be readable. The font is probably too small for people to see, but anybody who wants to read it, just send me an email and I can send you a copy of it. Now, Thompson became my mentor for the next 15 years, and he was very hard on me, but his criticisms were essential to my success. It's important for a young man to have a strong, older male role model whose opinion he can trust, and I trusted Thompson because he was always brutally honest with me. I would send him a manuscript and he would say, "Not your best work, try it again." I would work on something else and send it, and he would say, "Don't go in this direction, it's not where your strengths lie." And so on for many years until I finally sent him a manuscript and he said, "Hey, this is not bad, actually." And that became my second book, published in 2005, Celluloid Heroes and Mechanical Dragons. Thompson liked it enough to give it his imprimatur with a foreword. I had already published my first book in 1999, Twilight of the Clockwork God, Conversations on Science and Spirituality at the End of an Age, a collection of interviews with people like Thompson, Lynn Margulis, Rupert Sheldrake, Terence McKenna, Stanislav Grof, Deepak Chopra, etc. John LaBelle, also always a brutally honest critic, had the best line about my first book. "Hey, look, some of these guys are hacks, John." That made me laugh. Perhaps some of them were. But as I was doing all this work while my ex and I lived in that tiny red brick house in Mesa, the unemployment crisis hit us both at nearly the same time, and her solution was to go to work at a prostitution agency, which we'll get to in the next chapter, Chapter 7, The Birth of My Son.